Today at the National Press Club, journalist and press freedom advocate Peter Greste and Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen. They'll be discussing freedom of the press in the digital era and the importance of protecting whistleblowers. Peter Greste and Frances Haugen with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, coming to you today from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, Canberra. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. There has been much discussion about the role of misinformation, disinformation, and the role of social media in the referendum held on the weekend to consider constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians. But these factors are now having a massive influence on the way we all see the world, and that makes the role, in a much broader sense, and that makes the role of a free media all the more important. And it makes the importance of how we protect those who wish to get information to us against institutional and political odds all the more important. In that context, the National Press Club welcomes with great relief the release of journalist Cheng Lei by the Chinese authorities in the last few days. Who better to talk to us today about these issues than Peter Greste, the eminent Australian journalist, and Frances Haugen, who blew the whistle on the internal culture at Facebook. Please welcome them both to speak to us today.
Good afternoon. My name is Frances Haugen, and one of the topics that I never thought that I would become like an international speaker on is whistleblowing. My career was spent behind the scenes. In software development, there is a front end and there's a back end. So the front end is the thing that most of us take for granted is what software is. It is the pixels that we see on our screens, it's the buttons that we push, it's the animations that show up. I spent 15 years of my life in the most hidden parts of the software you interact with, the algorithms that choose what content you see, the order in which it's seen, how we find things on the internet. When I saw that something had to be done at Facebook, that Facebook had taken on critical national security roles in terms of fighting information operations, they had taken on the role of being the internet for some of the most vulnerable people in the world, by going into developing countries in South America, countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and saying, if you use our products, your data is free. If you use anything on the open internet, you'll pay for it yourself. When they came in and said, we are taking on this responsibility and telling the world that we are acting appropriately, we are taking care of people's safety, and then mischaracterizing it, and then going ahead and dissolving the one part of the company that was just to focus on making sure Facebook was a positive force in the world, I knew I had to get information to the public. At the same time, I never intended to end up in public, right? Part of why the disclosures were so large, 22,000 pages of internal documents, was I wanted them to be able to stand on their own. But over the course of even the first few months after I left Facebook, I learned a lot more about what it meant to be a whistleblower. My lawyers started kind of preparing me for what had I actually done. Like, there's a difference between knowing that something must be done and understanding the significance and the consequences of your actions. In the United States, there's an ecosystem of protections that allows people who bring information forward to the public to get resources they need in order to make the impact they want to see and to make sure that they're okay. I never thought that this was anomalous, right? I grew up in the United States. I grew up in the aftermath of Enron and WorldCom, where tens of billions of dollars were lit on fire in a moment because companies told the public lies, which eventually were uncovered. In that world, we said, hey, if we want to have a functioning capital market, if we want investors to be able to take risks, we have to have whistleblower protections. I had never realized that this was not the default state in other countries. As I emerged out, because we had a system of rewards through things like the SEC, I was able to get pro bono lawyers that looked after me, who offered me a wider range of services to make sure that I was okay, even though I didn't need all of them. You know, they had worked with other whistleblowers who, because they got threats from the public, they provided them with security protections. Whistleblowers who, because they had carried incredible burdens alone, you know, when I carried my burdens, I carried them with my parents. You know, I lived with them during COVID. So I didn't suffer the way most whistleblowers suffer. You know, they make sure they got therapy, or they make sure they get a rent subsidy so they can bridge that period of time when they're working in the public interest. I had no idea that that didn't exist almost anywhere else in the world. And so one of the things that it has been an interesting new path for me is in terms of talking to other places about how do we make sure that people in other countries take for granted one day that they too have whistleblower protections. My memoir, The Power of One, came out this summer. And it's a book not just about social media. It's about the idea that social media and the things that happen with Facebook are the first chapter in a major transition in our economy. You know, if I asked you, who's the last major Apple whistleblower you've heard of? I think most of you would struggle to name one. Like when I put it into Google, Apple whistleblower, the stuff that came back to me was from 2017, right? That's 6 years ago. If we look at Facebook, there are major revelations that get released from internal Facebook whistleblowers, maybe ones where you don't know their name, every month, every 2 months, and they kind of blur together. Why would Apple have so few whistleblowers and Facebook so many? Apple is an illustration of the manufacturing economy. They make a product. They make a product all of us can hold in our hand that we can take apart. Within hours of when a new iPhone comes out, there are videos on YouTube verifying the claims that Apple has made. They'll run performance tests to say, yes, it can perform the way Apple says it performs. They'll have videos where they take the screen off, they take the boards apart, they say, yes, that microchip is in there, yes, that camera's in there. Apple has very little incentive to lie because they will get caught. The reason we see whistleblowers from Facebook is Facebook has worked under the assumption that none of us could call them out since the company was founded. We each see a different version of the product. Most of the revelations in my disclosures were not novel when I came forward, right? Civil society groups, governments had accused Facebook of these things in the past. The thing that changed when I came forward was, for the first time, people could see Facebook knew these were problems and that they had chosen to mislead the public on them. Facebook had used the same playbook over and over again. What you're seeing is anecdotal, it's not representative. This is not what our platform is like. More and more of our economy is going to look like Facebook than like Apple. As AI becomes bigger and bigger, as more and more of what drives value in our economy comes from software running on data centers, running on binaries on our phones that we can't inspect, we will begin to see an era of opacity begin to creep into our economy. Unless we pass laws that say, hey, we will not repeat the errors of social media, we have to have transparency. You have to do public disclosures of risks. We have to protect whistleblowers. We will see repeats of what we saw with Facebook. Because anytime a company knows, the only people who know what's happening internally are the employees. There becomes this temptation to begin to diverge from what is actually happening and what the company says is happening. Anytime there's a profit motive and no feedback cycle to correct those lies, we will see those gaps get bigger and bigger. In the wake of my coming forward in the fall of 2021, the European Union said, we saw the value of whistleblower laws because how much impact the information in your disclosures had. Right? They said, we cannot live in an economy where we are dependent on people coming forward to tell the truth to be our first line of safety without making sure those same people have protections. I look forward to a world where 20 years from now, where there will be other Frances Haugens that keep the public safe on different issues. And I hope that they also take for granted that they have whistleblower protections too. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Frances, and it's an incredible, excuse me, it's an incredible honour to be here sharing the stage with Frances. I remember having a dinner with Frances at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas in Sydney a few years ago, and I was amazingly impressed by your capacity and your intelligence and your eloquence. Ladies and gentlemen, it's also a great honour to be here this afternoon, more than 8 years after I was last here at the National Press Club. That was in the heady days that followed my release from Egypt on terrorism charges back in 2015. And at the time, I was hugely gratified to be at home in a country that seemed committed to media freedom. You'll appreciate that after Egypt, that was something that really mattered a lot to me. As the dust settled and I began to think about the deeper reasons I'd wound up in Cairo's notorious Tora prison, I also started to think about how the Egyptian government had taken the national security rhetoric that swept across the world in the wake of 9/11 and given itself wide powers that it then used to lock up anyone who challenged the official narrative, and of course that included me. In broad terms, the Egyptian government had used loosely framed national security legislation to come after uncomfortable journalism. Now, the more I looked at our own country, the more I realised that we too had the same political winds driving us in much the same direction. Now, I am not being dramatic here. In the wake of 9/11, Australia had passed, successive Australian governments of all stripes had passed almost 100 separate pieces of legislation related to national security. That is more than any other country on earth. It was so prolific that one Canadian researcher described it as hyper-legislation, and that was back in 2010 when we'd only passed 50 new laws. In early 2019, my organisation, the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, published a white paper on press freedom and national security in Australia. In that document, we argued that because Australia doesn't have any explicit constitutional or legal protection for media freedom, many of the laws either directly or indirectly intruded on the media's ability to perform its democratic role in holding the government to account. Now, our white paper and the laws said the laws had criminalised much of what previously would have been considered as legitimate journalism. We said that journalist data had been exposed to intrusive police investigations, and crucially for this event, that journalist sources, the whistleblowers, were dangerously exposed and liable to prosecution. We published our white paper 2 weeks before the Australian Federal Police first knocked on the door of News Corp's political correspondent Annika Smethurst in the search for evidence of the sources to one of her stories, and then the next day went to the ABC's Sydney headquarters to do the same thing. In other words, we saw, guess what, a government using loosely framed national security legislation to come after uncomfortable journalism. After the raids, the New York Times did a deeper dive, and they declared that Australia may well be the world's most secretive democracy. Now, the Times listed several reasons for that bold statement, starting with that lack of any explicit constitutional protection for media freedom. It then pointed to our draconian secrecy laws, with heavy jail terms for whistleblowers who expose official information, even if it is in the public interest. Last month, I wrote an opinion piece for the Sydney Morning Herald, arguing that the laws protecting whistleblowing and media freedom were manifestly failing and contributing to deeply troubling culture of secrecy that's found its way into every level of the Australian government. I got a rather upset response from the Attorney General's office complaining that I'd failed to acknowledge the work that they'd done to fix some of these problems. Now, I might have been a bit harsh in that piece. The government has passed the National Anti-Corruption Commission legislation. A bit of chortling in the audience. The government has passed the National Anti-Corruption Commission legislation that includes some protections for journalists and their sources. It has passed amendments to whistleblowing laws, and Mark Dreyfus has commissioned a review of Commonwealth secrecy offences to see if the laws adequately protect public interest journalism. He's also dropped the charges against Bernard Collaery, and the government has said it will implement the recommendations of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security that it made in the wake of those AFP raids. There's also work to harmonise state shield laws that protect journalists in court. Now, all of that is laudable, but they're patches stitched onto legislation that hide a deeper problem, and it goes back to that lack of any constitutional protection for media freedom. Now, the ideal, of course, would be an amendment that writes the principle into the core of our Constitution, just like every other liberal democracy. But given the experience of last week's referendum and the way that most people see journalists here, I reckon it would be easier to get them to vote for cane toads. But my organisation, the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, has a solution. We're proposing a Media Freedom Act that would work in ways very similar to the Human Rights Acts in Queensland, the ACT and Victoria. There, the laws do three very simple things. First, they compel Parliament to always consider human rights whenever they're passing new legislation. They say the courts must always interpret existing legislation in ways that are consistent with human rights, and that civil servants must act in ways that support human rights. Now, if we replace the words human rights with media freedom, then I think we're close to a solution that would have profound implications for the relationship between government and the media, and through them, with the people that both are supposed to serve. In effect, we would be injecting a positive obligation to consider the importance of press freedom at every stage of the process. Now, I'm not arguing that it must trump everything all of the time, but because it's such a key part of any democracy, we must have a mechanism that takes the role of journalists and whistleblowers into account. Let's go back to those 2019 raids to see how such a Media Freedom Act might work. Remember that in neither case did the journalists publish anything that genuinely damaged national security. The police were investigating their sources simply because it's an offence to disclose classified information. It doesn't matter what was in those documents or why they were disclosed. To be clear now, I've got some sympathy for the police. They were just doing their jobs. They had evidence that laws were broken, and they had a legal obligation to investigate. But the journalists were also doing their jobs. It was indisputable that the stories they exposed were genuinely in the public interest, and they too had an ethical obligation to protect the whistleblowers who gave them the documents in the first place. Given the way the story of the raids exploded both here and abroad, I reckon everyone involved would have preferred to have avoided that situation rather than the ugly mess that it turned into. Our Media Freedom Act gives us a way out. It requires the police and the judge that was issuing the warrant to balance the public interest in protecting press freedom against the public interest in continuing the prosecution. If there is a compelling case for why the investigation trumps publication, then no problem. But it would be hard to argue that for those stories that clearly expose wrongdoing and where there's little demonstrable cost to national security, that any investigation should continue. In short, our Act would inject a presumption in favour of publishing and of the protection of sources into the core of our legal code. Now, in a lot of the conversations that followed the raids, we're often asked how to strike that balance between press freedom and national security. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. It implies a false binary. The idea of balance suggests that if we have more of one, by definition, we have less of the other. But what we've seen in recent years is that whistleblowers working with responsible journalists enhances national security. They expose failures of our security agencies, they provide important public debates about our national priorities, and they maintain the transparency so important to an effective democracy. In short, we should consider both media freedom and whistleblowing as integral to our national security, not in opposition to it. That's why I'm here as a media freedom activist. Whistleblower protections is a media freedom issue. That's also why it's what I sometimes describe as the chain of disclosure. Any broken link in that chain damages the integrity of the system it's trying to protect. Now, I know the government broadly agrees. That's why we've seen the reforms that I mentioned earlier. But while those are welcome steps, patching legislation here and there simply isn't enough. Mark Dreyfus was on the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security as the Shadow Attorney General when it published that report about press freedom after the 2019 raids. And at the time, he wrote a dissenting opinion in which he said that the recommendations were the bare minimum for reform, the starting point, and not the end of it. We agree. That's why we think the Media Freedom Act is the way forward. Now, we know that it's a big reform. We know it's going to take time and effort, so here are some other things the government should be doing now. There's a coalition of groups, including the Human Rights Law Centre, Griffith University and Transparency International, that's published a clear and straightforward roadmap for whistleblowing protections. The group acknowledges the legislative changes that the government has already made, but it says that they are both minor and technical. It argues that without more substantial reforms, they're unlikely to make a material difference to the experience of whistleblowers. The government has promised more action, but we haven't seen any details. We also need an independent whistleblower protection authority to oversee and enforce the laws and support whistleblowers. That's not revolutionary. There are many similar bodies like it in the US, in Slovakia, the Netherlands, and elsewhere. But the most straightforward thing also seems to be the toughest. The Attorney General needs to drop the prosecutions of the two most prominent whistleblowers in Australia today. There's Richard Boyle, the tax office official who exposed its corrupt and unethical debt collection practices in South Australia. He tried to complain internally, but the complaints were dismissed, so he went to the ABC. The story triggered national outrage and changes to the ATO's practices. And Richard's reward? A ruined career, mental health challenges, and dozens of charges related to illegally recording phone conversations and protected information. His trial is due to start next year. The other case is David McBride, the military lawyer for the Special Forces. He found evidence that some Australian SAS troops had murdered unarmed civilians in Afghanistan. David compiled a dossier that he took to his superiors and later to the Australian Federal Police, and when nothing happened, in line with his understanding of the whistleblower law, he went to the ABC. They turned that into what became known as the Afghan Files. Now, in less than a month, we will see the first trial in relation to those documents, but it won't be any of the soldiers accused of committing the crimes. It will be David, the whistleblower. He's pleaded not guilty to 5 charges, including the unauthorised disclosure of information, theft of Commonwealth property, and breaching the Defence Act. David's case is, I think, a very good example of the way in which laws designed to protect national security can sometimes undermine it. Years after the Afghan Files story broke, the Brereton report into alleged war crimes vindicated the leak and the ABC's reporting. It forced the military to rethink its culture, and it's likely that we will see prosecutions of some of the SAS soldiers accused of breaking the laws of war. The whistleblowers and the journalists helped, not hindered, Australia's national security. So given all of that, it's hard to see how the prosecutions of McBride and Boyle can possibly be in the national interest. Their cases matter. Obviously, there is a narrow moral question of whether it's right that they be punished for what they exposed, but they also matter for the signals that they send across Australia. How can anyone take the Attorney General's commitment to protecting whistleblowing at its word when the two most prominent examples are heading to court and quite possibly to prison? Back in 2020, the then opposition leader Anthony Albanese spoke to Crikey about the case of Bernard Collaery, who was also facing prosecution at the time. Mr. Albanese said, and I quote, "The idea that there should be prosecutions of a whistleblower for what is a shameful part of Australia's history is simply wrong." It's hard to see how his remarks back then wouldn't apply to both Richard Boyle and David McBride today. Thank you.
Well, thanks to both of you. Francis, if I could talk to you first. I'll just
sorry to make you do the long way round. If you appeared before a congressional hearing on the Facebook matter, I suppose it would be interesting for our audience to know what the impact was of your testimony. Has there been a change in the regime in the US? And what sort of change has actually come about from Facebook?
So the largest changes we've seen have come out of the European Union, where the Digital Services Act was passed in the spring of last year. Looking at the United States, there's always this causality thing of, were the disclosures not a big enough impact, or we don't have a Speaker of the House still. We're on day 13. It's the second longest in US history, so fingers crossed. One of the things that's really important to understand about Facebook is the product we use in the United States is not similar to Facebook anywhere else in the world. Right? Facebook overinvests in safety systems in the United States. They make product changes to make it more innocuous, less threatening in the United States. For example, they turned off news for us last year, even though we didn't have a media bargaining act. They just said, we're going to show less news without disclosing what constituted news or which sources are news. And now major outlets say they get 60 to 70% less traffic from Facebook. There was a lot of change from Facebook in the first year after I came out. They doubled the amount they spent on safety. They invested more in, one of my core concerns was around linguistic equity. So safety systems should not be dependent on which language you speak. They invested in more languages, deeper, higher quality coverage. Unfortunately, Elon Musk bought Twitter last year and reduced headcount by 75%. And in the last few months, Mark Zuckerberg has come out in public before and said, Elon showed you could rip the Band-Aid off and there were no consequences. And he fired basically the headcount that he had brought on in the wake of my disclosures. And so I would say we are in a much more precarious position we are today as we wait for the European Union's legislation to start to actually come into force. Because it's not just Twitter, it's not just Facebook that are spending less on safety. It's YouTube, it's Reddit, because they're all following now in the model of Elon Musk.
And so Facebook, the measures that the European Union are taking, are they powerful enough, and is the way the market works conducive to that having a knock-on effect in other jurisdictions like the US?
I think there's I'm cautiously optimistic. So this is one of these things where they're actually trying to implement the laws that they wrote. So the law that they wrote basically says, hey, you know your business better than we do. You've intentionally kept us, you've operated behind a curtain. You need to tell us what harms you know about. You need to tell us what your plan is for preventing or mitigating that harm. And you need to give us enough data that we can see that you're making progress. Oh, and by the way, if we ask you a question, you have to actually give us an answer, which sounds like a really basic standard of that's the floor. But I'll give you context. I've talked to senior governmental leaders in Canada in the last 6 months, where they say things like, we ask TikTok questions as simple as, how many Canadians use TikTok? And they give us answers like, you'd like to know that, wouldn't you? Right, we never have these kinds of standards for other similarly powerful industries. If a newspaper said, we're not going to tell you where we get our funding from, we would not accept that, right? We wouldn't accept if politicians got paid by people we didn't know. We expect to have transparency. We tolerate it with this tech exceptionalism. And so my hope is that as we get any data out of anywhere in the world, for the first time we see kind of what are the consequences of how these companies operate. And my hope is that they don't, they seem to be choosing to live up to the potential of what they wrote. They're not backing down when the companies give very weak responses. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that once that transparency is open, we can start demanding more from those companies.
Peter, sort of starting at the pointy back end of your speech, why do you think the Attorney General won't act on these two cases?
Look, I think that's a question that I know anybody who's been thinking seriously about the two cases and whistleblowing generally is really struggling with. The Attorney General says it's because they don't meet the standard of exceptional circumstances that he thinks that they need to cross before he can intervene. Clearly it's going to always be a big deal for an Attorney General to personally intervene in a case and to override the Director of Public Prosecutions. But I fail to see how these two cases don't qualify as exceptional circumstances. There is nothing in the law anyway that says that that's a required standard for the Attorney General. But let's set that aside for a moment. The fact is that these cases are easily the most prominent examples of whistleblowing in this country. And if you are a civil servant and you're sitting on something that you know is wrong, that you're contemplating going to the media, and you're seeing on the one hand the kind of fairly technical changes that have been made so far and the rhetoric coming out of the Attorney General's office, which is encouraging at one level, but then on the other hand, you see the kind of suffering that David McBride and Richard Boyle have both experienced, the cost of their careers, the financial damage, the emotional stress, the trauma that they've been through, and the fact that they are both about to be in court and quite likely wind up in prison. What are you going to do? What's the effect going to be on your own motivation? I think that will have a terribly chilling effect on whistleblowing, and I think it's likely to undo any of the work that the Attorney General is doing to try and support whistleblowing.
Sarah Ison.
Sarah Ison from The Australian. Thank you for both of your addresses. At the beginning, Laura mentioned misinformation and disinformation and how, obviously some big buzzwords there. In Australia, we're looking at this now, and Labor does have some draft legislation about how to deal with this. It wants to expand the powers of the Australian Communication and Media Authority to crack down on social media giants. There is concern about the impact that this would have to free speech. Particularly, there's also a push for media outlets to be included in this rather than exempt, as is currently drafted. Given just how big a deal this is here, I just wanted your thoughts on this legislation, if you think it does present concern on freedom of speech, if it's very, very necessary, just any thoughts that you have on that particular area of policy.
I'm a big proponent that right now, everyone in this room, even myself, is working at such an information asymmetry to these platforms that it's not really possible to have an effective democratic debate on how we should intervene without us first passing transparency legislation. Like if we started from the perspective of saying right now, these systems that are regulating what information we see or don't see, we have no transparency into them, right? Like the fact that I could say in the United States, they decide we're not gonna show so much news. Like what does it mean to be the news? Like think about how much is loaded in a statement like that. We have no idea what is in or out, what the biases are. I think we would probably be better served by starting from a vantage point of knowing how these systems operate before coming in and saying, we know how we're going to solve this problem. And I think I've heard from both sides of the political spectrum a lot of apprehension about coming in and saying, we're to a place where we can actually enforce on content when there is such ambiguity around like how do you prove if enough misinformation is being taken down, that kind of thing.
Do you think those concerns bear merit? Do you share them?
So we're very clear in what we support as our nonprofit, which is we only endorse transparency legislation today, and we don't wade into individual bills because like I am not a lawyer and I don't have like a staff to like read and process bills. But I do strongly endorse that we need to give ACMA powers to force disclosure. And I think there's a space that we can all agree to. Like we have ingredient labels on food, right? Like if you say this can of beans has XYZ in it, that has to be in there. You can't lie. Right now, we don't even have ingredient labels on these systems, and so I think that's where we can all agree to start from.
Do you have any thoughts yourself as well?
Look, I think Francis is clearly the expert on this stuff. I mean, I entirely agree. The principle of transparency has surely got to be at the heart of this, and it bothers me enormously that the social media companies that have effectively taken on the status of utility, of public utility, because this is how we communicate. We get terribly upset. The government gets really upset when a Chinese company might be taking over some of the infrastructure for 5G systems, and yet we say nothing about TikTok or social media companies that are monetizing our attention, not necessarily for nefarious purposes, but for their own profits. It's designed to serve them, not us. And yet when the communication is so integral to the way that or the platforms are so integral to the way that we communicate and understand the world around us, we have to make sure that they work for us. I don't see how we can land anywhere else, to be honest.
What I would say is a danger of how the bill is currently structured is tech companies know exactly how to stop tech regulations, which is they call them censorship bills, right? And I watched play out in Canada. So there's a Canadian content bill. It's based on the idea that 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the U.S. border, but they do not want to be Americans, right? Like we respect Canada. It goes both ways. All that CanCon said was, right now we require our TV stations, our radio stations to pay into a trust so that we can have a Canadian identity, right? We say 10% of what you show has to be Canadian. Right now, people don't get content on Netflix by searching. They get it because Netflix shows it to them. Like Netflix should have to show you 10% Canadian content. They should have to pay into the trust. And the way that bill got characterized all over the internet was it was a censorship bill. And part of that was pushed by big tech. I think we need to, people, as we think strategically around the world, how do we get bills across the finish line? Understand what will get weaponized. And if you start with transparency, that's a thing that's, if you said, we're doing a censorship transparency bill, that steals the fire away from big tech, right?
Thank you.
Anna Henderson.
Anna Henderson from SBS World News. Just a quick question to each of you, if that's okay. Firstly, to you, Peter, what do you think are the domestic and international pressures that are influencing the decision to pursue or not to intervene on the government side in the David McBride prosecution? And do you think there is some punishment which is reasonable for breaching national security?
Let's start with the second. Well, the first question, it's very hard to know where the pressures go, where the pressures are. I think that I understand why the security establishment is very concerned about leaks of any sort. I was talking to someone from the intelligence community about this who said, look, I find it very difficult, even though conceptually I recognise the value of the leaks, I find it impossible to accept the idea that someone should walk out of an Australian government building with a file stamped classified under their arm. That's what the intelligence and security establishment is trying to stop. That's what the law is designed to do. What the law doesn't have the capacity to do is to distinguish between something that is in the public interest when it exposes a failure of those systems, as opposed to something that is being released for nefarious purposes. It's been released to try and undermine the security establishment or the security systems of our country. I accept that there is a need, absolutely accept that there is a need for us to protect classified information. I'm not an absolutist when it comes to media freedom, but I do believe that we need to inject the opportunity to argue in favour of publication, in favour of releasing classified information when there is a clear public interest. There will always be grey areas around this, but I think that the grey zone is much narrower than we're often led to believe.
Thank you. And Francis?
Or just to back you up there, we have in the United States, we have lawyer confidentiality. Like if you tell your lawyer that you committed a crime, the lawyer doesn't have to testify against you. But if the lawyer helps you commit a crime, they don't get shielded, right? And I think there's this question, he witnessed a crime. Should the law protect the government when crimes take place, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what the legislation, what whistleblower law is supposed to do is protect not just crimes of illegal activity, disclosing illegal activity, but disclosing things that are immoral or corrupt. And we know that people working in the intelligence community or working with classified documents are as capable of corrupt behaviour as anyone else. We need to recognise that whistleblowing should extend into those parts of government as well.
And Francis, if you were wanting to blow the whistle but you lived in Australia, you think you would do it given the laws that we have in place?
So I always kind of cringe a little bit when people give me credit for being like brave or noble or that kind of thing, because like I came forward because I felt Facebook had stolen my future from me, right? That I looked at where I sat, and at that point there were maybe 20 or 30 people in the company that understood what was going on, like really understood what was going on, because like there's 300 or 400 people in the industry who really understand how these algorithms work and like how the features interact with them, and half of them are retired because they made tons of money at Facebook, right? And of those people, most of them are not people who have the skill set to communicate with non-technical people. Like literally my job as a product manager was to like get a lawyer to understand like what a data scientist does, like that kind of thing. And when I came to Facebook, there'd been one ethnic violence incident caused by Facebook, right? Like the UN had come out and been like, here's a 250-page report on like the massacre that happened in Myanmar. And by the time I left, there were 2, right? And Facebook, because of things I worked on, I watched, they knew it was coming months and months before it. I watched what level of involvement they did. I watched them dissolve the team that was supposed to prevent against January 6th, and then have no one to call, like raise their hand when Stop the Steal started forming, right? And I could see that if I did nothing, I was gonna lay in bed in 20 years and watch it happen again and again and again. And so I would have totally done it here just because I felt they stole my life from me. But you know, not everyone is going to have something that is at that level of life and death. Right? Like I think 10 or 20 million people's lives or more are on the line in the next 20 years. Most problems are not at that magnitude. And so there's this question of when do we want people to feel safe to bring things to the public interest? Because systems that have feedback cycles perform better. Systems that have feedback cycles are more efficient. They are more aligned with the truth. You get higher quality employees because people don't like living with lies. And so I think we want to make sure that all voices get heard.
Kat Wong.
Thank you for your time. First of all, Frances, I just wanted to ask you, you kind of touched on how AI creates opacity. So I was wondering if you could kind of expand on that a little bit. How does AI create opacity for FANG companies, and how do FANG companies then use this to undermine transparency and whistleblowing and freedom of press and that kind of stuff?
So it's not just FANG companies. Like OpenAI is in FANG. Anthropic is in FANG. The Microsoft isn't under FANG. It's interesting, in France they're called GAFAM because Microsoft's included in it. But so systems where we get a physical product at the end, so like I say a car, any physical manufacturing, we can put sensors outside that factory, we can measure the water, we can measure the soil, the air, we can interview the employees that put it together when they walk out, because like there's a lot of them usually. When we start getting into scalable systems that run on data centers, a very small number of people can have civilization impacting levels of power, right? Like at Facebook, there's a very small number of people who really understand how these algorithms work, and yet it impacts what everyone sees in the news, right? The information environment around the world. We need to learn lessons from social media to apply to AI. So for example, if we don't pass laws that say, if you have a large language model, you need to be able to have a mechanism where a researcher can get access to your product and not have to pay for it. Like if they're a certified researcher, they should be able to go and ask questions, be able to look at data, because we will see the same thing we saw with social media. Each person will get different experiences of that product. When we see what kind of scale that can impact, that can have really serious consequences. Like for example, just so people are aware of today, there are no test sets today around child safety and large language models, right? We have test sets for things like, can it do math? Can it do legal reasoning? Can it do basic science questions? We don't have things that say like, hey, like if a kid asks you, I have this much older boyfriend, like how do I go visit them without my parents knowing? Like there's nothing to test for, does that large language model actually make the right call? If we don't have mechanisms where we get to interrogate those questions, we are going to see the same thing in terms of like a race to the bottom, right? Speed gets rewarded in the market. Going fast, move fast, break things, that gets rewarded with more investment. OpenAI could have launched ChatGPT or ChatGPT 3 multiple years earlier than it did. Like, these models were hanging around Silicon Valley. People knew about them, and they intentionally did not release it because they said this is too dangerous. Now you have things like Facebook followed right off of the ChatGPT announcement and published their model, right? We have an opportunity right now to have questions about incentives, like how do we encourage good behavior? Things like having large companies come out and say, I will only invest in, I will only buy services from AIs that are transparent and that act in the public good. But if we don't act, we will see a repeat of what we saw with social media.
And what does that mean for press freedoms as well?
Oh, for press freedoms. I think it's going to be, I think the rise of automated journalism scares me because like part of what, like these systems are not actually intelligent, right? These systems are the kind of product of the internet, and the internet is full of things that are not true. And when we say, you know, synthesizing press releases is what journalists do, when we reduce down what is journalism, we might be able to get ad clicks on it. You know, we might be able to, you know, expand the reach of our newspaper, but that's not actually like what is most vital of the role of journalism in a democracy.
And Peter as well. Obviously, you mentioned the plight of David McBride. So I just wanted to ask, I guess Australia has been very fast to move on the prosecution of the whistleblower, but less so on the prosecution of war crimes, and less so on even calling out war crimes, alleged or investigating war crimes in Israel as well. So I guess, what does this reveal about the Australian government and maybe more broadly about Australia?
Gosh, yeah, you're inviting me to wade into the Israel-Gaza story. I've left my flak jacket at home, didn't I? Look, I think we need to be careful about drawing too many conclusions about Australia's attitude to war crimes. Obviously, I am very concerned about, I think that it's wrong for David McBride to be prosecuted at all. It's certainly wrong that he should be the first person to be prosecuted in relation to the Afghan files and the allegations of war crimes that they revealed. I think that Australia generally has a problem, as I mentioned in the speech, has a problem with transparency and accountability. I think we are far too closed, too secretive, particularly within our military. I've worked with a lot of military forces around the world over the years, and I've found that the Australian Defence Force is some of the most difficult to work with of any in the world. And I've worked with, as I said, I've worked with a lot. I don't think that helps us as a public. I don't think it helps the ADF. I don't think it helps the relationship of the ADF to the public. I think that the government needs to be, and the ADF itself needs to be far more transparent about the work that it does, the operations it conducts, and also when it gets things wrong. I think that is going to make a far healthier relationship between the ADF and the public, and I also happen to think that would make a huge difference to the experience of veterans when they re-engage with the public and re-enter public life, because we'd have a far better understanding and a better and deeper sympathy with what they go through. I just think that at the moment, generally speaking, as a country, and particularly with our security and defence agencies, we are too obsessed with secrecy, with keeping these things closed, to keeping things internally. And I think that's causing a huge amount of problems for everybody.
If I could just indulge on this point, and it's really asking you to speculate, but it's sort of striking that when all of these revelations came out, and then Burton and various other inquiries said, yes, this is actually happening, the CDF came out and said, yeah, we've got to change this, but it was closed down. Do you think in some ways we've missed a golden moment to change that culture?
I do. And I think, and as I said, I don't think it's just to the detriment of us as the public. I think the ADF is suffering and will continue to suffer as a result. You know, hands up here who can remember the last time you saw a story about what the Australian Defence Forces were up to anywhere outside our own borders. You know, I can't remember the last time I ever saw it, and I think the fact that, I mean, they are engaged. We know they're engaged in operations. We just have no idea what they're doing. And because we don't have any idea, there is that culture of impunity. There is that culture of untouchability. We saw that with the SAS. A lot of the reporting is really, that we have seen, some of the incredible reporting that we've seen from people like Nick McKenzie, Mark Willesee, and Chris Masters, have all shown the way that the ADF and the Special Forces in particular have a culture of untouchability. And I think that contributed to the alleged crimes that we've seen. Obviously, we need to see the results of any prosecutions, but it seems quite clear that it's caused a lot of problems, not just for Afghans, but for our own defence forces. And through that, it's created a lot of enemies. It hasn't solved the problems. It's, you know, for every unarmed, every civilian that we kill, either intentionally or unintentionally, we create a whole family of people who want revenge. And I think that does nothing for our security.
Just for context, in Silicon Valley, there is a salary premium for working at Facebook that it can be 30, 40% over your next highest offer. And that's because when you have organizations that are able to keep drifting and drifting, and there's no feedback cycle, people aren't stupid, right? Like, people come out of those organizations and say, it's really, really unpleasant to work there. And like, you can create national security problems for yourself if over time you can't attract or retain high quality people, because most people are not sociopaths. They don't want to do things where other people get hurt. And it's a thing where you want to nick that in the bud as soon as you can.
Yeah, and as you said, it's about that closed loop. It's where you don't have any way of disrupting the kind of internal cycles.
Sarah Tomevska.
Thank you both. Sarah Tomevska from SBS. The Australian government is continuing to advocate for Julian Assange's release on the grounds that his case has gone on for too long, not on the principle of press freedom, which I guess has been criticised in some quarters as sending the wrong message to authoritarian regimes. Peter, I know that you have said that he can't claim press freedom as a defence because you don't think he exercised journalistic responsibility. Where do you see his case now, and should the government be more forthcoming in advocating for press freedom?
Let me be absolutely clear. I absolutely support Julian Assange. I think his case has gone on far too long. He deserves to be released. I think that a lot of the revelations that WikiLeaks made were profoundly important. They exposed some horrendous abuses. No one can possibly look at the collateral murder videos and not recognise just how important it was that that be released. And so I completely support Julian Assange in that regard. It's only when we get down to the narrow question of whether or not press freedom should be used that I start to have some difficulties, particularly because we've come to think about journalism as a process, and I can talk about that separately, but we think that we need to change the way we approach to defining not who is a journalist, but what journalism is. And it's because of that understanding that I find it difficult to apply media freedom arguments to Julian's case. But I do not want that to distract from my own personal, very vivid, very enthusiastic support for Julian in his case. And on that basis alone, I think the Australian government needs to advocate very forcefully for Julian's release.
Do you think because obviously press freedom is enshrined in the US Constitution, it's not enshrined in ours, does that diminish the government's argument? If they put that forward, do you think that would make any difference, notwithstanding your own personal views?
Look, I think the First Amendment protects, the US First Amendment protects not just press freedom, but freedom of speech. It's that freedom of speech, that very powerful freedom of speech protection, which has allowed the US to, and Francis, you might have your own views on the impact of the First Amendment, but it's allowed huge amounts of latitude for people to say and speak about things that we can't in this country. And so I would argue that the First Amendment alone is something that the Australian government should be pointing to in the United States. Clearly, I think that we need our own constitutional protections for freedom of speech, for press freedom, and we've spoken about that. We don't have it. Our solution is what I think for a Media Freedom Act is achievable. It's something short of constitutional change. Obviously, it doesn't affect what you're talking about, but I think in the broad terms, I think the First Amendment is something that the Australian government should be pointing to.
Thank you.
Nick Stewart.
Francis, you've said that basically, you know, this communications are a bit like transport, like roads. We need them in order to exist as a society. You don't want to privatise all the roads to somebody. Why doesn't Australia develop its own Facebook, its own TikTok? I mean, why should something as important and vital as this be privatised? Why can't we, for example, have an ABC that deals with TikTok, or that provides a personal, individual aspect of Facebook for all of us? And Peter, why does this government continue to prosecute people who they're quite happy to, in the past, piggyback off the back of to say there are war crimes in Afghanistan, but we're still prosecuting these sort of people? It's outrageous, isn't it? Where are both the Attorney General and particularly Anthony Albanese's principles to allow people to keep swinging in the breeze with this enormous overhang hanging over them, just leaving them out to dry?
They're not swinging the breeze. They're not hanging out to dry. They're about to go to court. You know, look, I can't speak for the government. All I can do is point to what Anthony Albanese said back in 2020 when he was talking about Bernard Collaery. The idea of a whistleblower being prosecuted for exposing what's a shameful part of Australia's history is absolutely shameful, and I just hope that he can see that and follow through with that.
Francis?
There's a concept known as a network effect. So part of why we don't privatize the roads, or at least beyond, say, a few choice highways, or we don't privatize like the protocol that telephones use. So in the United States, we have many phone carriers that you can choose, but there's interoperability, is because networks, as they add more members, become more valuable. I strongly support the development of public infrastructure. Or I think there's going to be some really interesting experiments around creator and user-owned networks in the future. But in terms of how TikTok operates today or how Facebook operates today, we have a challenge, which is there's people Australians want to talk to who aren't in Australia. In the case of TikTok, TikTok is designed explicitly to be very, very international in that it prioritizes content that doesn't have language in it. Right? A funny dance can be viewed by anyone in the world. A makeup tutorial can be viewed by anyone in the world. Australia can try to introduce a TikTok competitor, and for certain niches, it's going to be effective. But it's, I think, more important for us to step in and say, for any platform that touches more than, say, 10% of Australians, it should have to play by some baseline rules. And I think there's major opportunities to get in alignment with other countries. Like Singapore is super interested in exploring the space. I think Australia and Singapore together could take a leadership role in Southeast Asia, where we can come in and say, let's get some consistent rules on transparency. Let's share resources for investigations, for research, or get in line with the European Union. And then you can start to say, even though these are global platforms, we can hold them accountable.
Hi,
thanks for your address today. Peter, you've spoken about the need for constitutional protection for national freedom here in Australia, and referendums aren't easy to win. We've been reminded of that this weekend. What are some of the concerns maybe that you have that would threaten the success of a referendum if we were to?
Look, as I said, it's no secret, and I think everyone in this room would recognise that journalists aren't Australia's most admired occupation. You know, the opinion polls, the Edelman Trust Barometer consistently shows that less than 50% of Australians trust news, trust journalists, and so I think the idea that we could convince a majority of Australians in a majority of states to protect journalists and journalism is just not realistic. It's not going to happen, and I'd be very surprised if we saw politicians nailing their colours to a constitutional amendment supporting media freedom. I think if we can convince, and I think we can convince enough Australians that a free press is vital to what we are trying to do, to our democracy, then I think we have the opportunity to see enough political momentum that would push through a Media Freedom Act. One of the things that we are doing at the AJF is trying to figure out how to distinguish journalism that meets a certain professional standard from everything else online, and hopefully give the social media companies, give the journalists themselves an opportunity to badge their work, and social media companies a signal to boost that content up so that we are able to see that good journalism in and of itself is valuable and useful and important and qualitatively different from the rest of the content that we see online. If we can do that, if we can make people recognise that good journalism produced to a standard is worth protecting, then I think we can see a Media Freedom Act. We can see the kind of support that will get this through. Without it, I think we're going to see ourselves in a lot of trouble.
Thank you.
Can I just, I mean, we've been talking about misinformation and also about protecting journalism. I suppose I'm just interested in what you both think about what we actually do about dealing with that misinformation, because that's the great irony. You know, here we are trying to protect, you know, credible journalism, but the really big problem so much of the time is that basically anybody can say anything now. And while I imagine it would be a huge dilemma in the States that you would try to sort of shut that down, then, you know, have you got any thoughts about what should happen then?
I have 2 years of speaking on this, and I have a book that came out this summer, The Power of One. It never ranks high on Amazon. I wonder why, but it is there. Just keep scrolling down, you know. So we can either focus on safety after the fact. So Facebook has spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars to promote the idea that we have one tool to keep ourselves safe, right? Take down, censor content at the end, content moderation. And that's because they really don't want to have us ask questions about why is it that misinformation gets the most distribution, right? Going back as far as 2018, and this was a core part of the revelations, Facebook changed how they prioritize content to reward content that got a response, right? It used to be content that kept you around was the best content. Then they said if you get a comment, a reshare, a like, a click, that's what good content is. And overnight, political parties across Europe started saying, hey, we know you changed the algorithm. Now our most divisive, polarizing, worst content is the stuff that gets the most distribution. the BuzzFeed CEO wrote to Facebook and said, we don't know what's going on Facebook. The content we're most ashamed of is the stuff we're now getting the most traffic back from Facebook. So these choices matter. So the question is, right now, there's no feedback cycle. Like, they can make little tweaks to the algorithm for their own business objectives, and that's why they changed the algorithm back then. They saw that if they got you more likes, more comments, more reshares, you produced more content for them, which meant now there's more content to run ads against. They didn't have to account for the offset of more misinformation got spread, more polarizing, more hateful content got spread. We have things that could, as simple as if you require someone to click a link before you reshare it, that's 10 or 15% less misinformation in the system. Like, no one's censored by being required to click on a link before you reshare.
One of the things, though, that I think we might have spoken about this when we had dinner a while back, is the idea that the algorithms are somehow neutral, and that if you are changing an algorithm to reduce misinformation, then you're somehow censoring the system. But in fact, the algorithms are already biased in favour of that kind of content because, as you've said, that kind of content generates eyeballs and income. There is an inherent bias already there. The bias that runs through the systems is to monetize attention. So if we accept that they're created with that particular bias in mind, it makes perfect sense to say, no, we need to make them biased towards the middle, towards sensible conversations, towards rational debate, towards good, solid, well-grounded, fact-based information.
So imagine a world where we said, hey, right now, if something gets seen by 10,000 people, most of us would agree it is no longer private, right? If we had a feed of all the, so let's say every week they published, here's every post in Australia that got seen more than 10,000 times, and here's some statistics about them. We could look at that and say, why is it the content that got the most distribution is the most extreme content? And now suddenly there's a countervailing force, like when they're trying to decide, should they do this feature or should they do that feature? If something increases misinformation by 10%, or like if we ship this feature, it's gonna be 10% less misinformation, 20% less misinformation, but it's gonna cost us 0.1% of profit, 0.2% of profit. There are documents from the Facebook files where data scientists bemoan the fact that they weren't allowed to ship changes that would have reduced misinformation by that much because there was no equivalency inside of Facebook. They never said 10% misinformation is worth 1% of profit. But when you have that transparency, now they have to think about it because people will ask, why did misinformation just shoot up 20%?
Sure. Final question from Morris Riley.
Peter, you'll be pleased to know some of my best friends are journalists. They're not toads. They're very good people to deal with, particularly late at night. They're very good. So, my question is the Media Freedom Act. I think that's probably a logical course that you're promoting today. Yes. It's going to require bipartisan or multi-partisan support. Who are you going to bring to the table to influence our lawmakers?
Look, I think the Media Freedom Act, as we've designed it, is not something that is a partisan idea. It doesn't favour the left or the right. I think, across the parties, and we've had some discussions already with quite a few MPs who generally support the idea of openness and transparency in government, of the ability of journalists to do their jobs, of protecting those principles in law. I guess the challenge is introducing something that I think would very profoundly change the relationship between government and the media. We've got a model in place that supports press freedom on the one hand, but also supports improved journalistic standards on the other. And I think we can, if we can sell those two things, if we can sell a system that supports improved professional standards to our politicians, but also sell a Media Freedom Act to our journalists, then we've got the chance of actually getting something through. Our model, starting with the Media Freedom Act, benefits everybody. I think that it would be a profound and important change in Australian democracy, as I said, not just for us, because we are the media. The media, by definition, is the means by which information flows. But if we're doing our jobs, then, of course, it's the Australian public. It's our entire democracy that benefits. That is not a partisan concept. I don't see that we need to think of it as a partisan issue.
Before I thank our two speakers today, I just note that we've been joined by somebody who's been the subject of quite a lot of conversation today, David McBride. So welcome. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking Francis and Peter for talking to us today.